and affordable, that's sustainable, and that's also environmentally responsible with respect both to minimizing local bads, particulate pollution, and global bads like global warming. These are fundamental challenges. But there are dilemmas and trade-offs that arise when we try to secure that complex goal. For example, what if the cheapest sources of energy are also the dirtiest? So how do we get markets and governments to work together with local communities to align on solutions that are sustainable? What's the role of public policy and also of international cooperation in achieving these goals? Now, in Southeast Asia, we encounter some of these questions, and perhaps some of these dilemmas too, in their most acute and concentrated form. Energy and its nexus with development is a question of acute relevance to the whole region. To give you some examples set out in the latest IEA report on the region, energy demand in Southeast Asia is due to rise by 80% to 2040. Demand for power is due to treble. Now, meeting that demand successfully can have tremendously positive consequences, including for lifting millions of people out of poverty. But the IEA report also notes that of the sources of supply that could potentially meet this escalating demand, coal could be set to rise at the fastest rate. Their base scenario projections see coal increasing from 1/3 to 1/2 of the total feedstock of power generation. Carbon dioxide emissions, they argue, are set to double as a proportion of global emissions from 4% to 8%. Many put their hope in the potential for renewables in the region, but this is not unproblematic either. If we look at the discourse and narratives which are evolving around large hydro projects now, the damming of the Mekong, the Salween River as well. Some of you might have seen a very intriguing and lyrical long piece in The Economist a few months ago, including with some lovely sound effects from the Mekong River in the online version of this article. A very uneconomist-like article setting out the concerns about the future of this great river arising from the ambitious plans to dam it that are already in train, of course. And there's a question of the sources of finance that might meet the infrastructure needs of energy development in the region. The IEA sets out a figure of $2.5 trillion between now and 2040 to meet the energy needs of the region. Where will that financing come from? Particularly if international financial institutions scale back their readiness to support financing coal-fired power stations, for example, or even large hydro. Some of these questions remain in the balance. We had a good discussion of these themes 2 years ago, and there have been some developments since then that will feed into the context of our discussion today. One, of course, is that the global oil price has fallen by about 60%, and with it the gas price as well. Secondly, we've had the historic COP Conference and Parties 21 agreement in Paris last December on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And thirdly, if we're looking at political solutions and governance solutions to these questions, we've seen changes of government, in particular in Thailand and also in Myanmar. So those are some initial reflections to set the context for what I'm sure a very stimulating discussion this morning. We have a very diverse and expert panel to explore these questions, and we'd like this session also to be as interactive as possible. So questions and comments, thoughts and reflections will be very, very welcome from all of the participants today. begin by introducing our first speaker, Diana Suhardiman, who works at the International Water Management Institute in Laos. She comes to us from the region. She has over a decade of experience in natural resource governance, with a particular focus on water issues in Asia. She's also the author of a recently published book, Bureaucracy and Development, Reflections from the Indonesia Water Sector. Diana, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank the organizer to invite me to be part of this roundtable discussion. Today, my talk will focus mainly on hydropower development in Southeast Asia, with particular emphasis on the Mekong region. So, as a renewable energy, hydropower development is often advocated as a more sustainable development alternative as compared to non-renewable, such as fossil fuels or gases. I will argue, however, that while hydropower is indeed a source of renewable energy, this does not automatically result in hydropower development being sustainable, technically, financially, socially, and environmentally. So geographically, the Mekong region covers a vast area of 6 neighboring countries: Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, China Yunnan Province, Laos, and Vietnam. The Mekong Basin itself covers a total area of 800,000 square kilometers, inhabited by approximately 60 million people. And Mekong hydropower is developing rapidly. From the map here, you can see that in the upper part of the Mekong River, or the Lancang River in China, China has already built 5 large hydropower dams on the main stem of the Mekong River. These hydropower dams have power generating capacity ranging from 1,000 to 5,000 megawatts. And according to the Challenge Program Water and Food, as well as the Mekong River Commission database, there are 36 dams already in operation in the lower Mekong basins, incorporating Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, and approximately 100 dams more are being planned, under licensing, or under construction. So you can see from this map, 12 of these planned mainstream dams are in the main stem of the Mekong River, with Sayaburi Dam now under construction. Currently, for Laos in particular, there are 99 dams planned in addition to 17 hydropower dams already under operation. While rapid hydropower dam development seems to slow down a bit in China Yunnan Province, as well as in Vietnam due to some of other factors related to the slowing down of the economy, hydropower development is back to the government's policy agenda in Myanmar, with 8 large hydropower dams planned in the Salween River mainstream alone. As we can see from this map, there are a couple of river basins in the region, such as Irrawaddy and Salween in Myanmar, bordering China and Thailand, as well as Mekong, Red River, and the Yangtze. So while hydropower development could benefit countries in the region in terms of increasing its economic growth, both as power supplier and power buyer, many are also concerned about its potential social and environmental impacts. For instance, while the Asian Development Bank Regional Power Trade Plan has highlighted the high potential of Mekong hydropower to ensure regional energy security, increase export earnings, and reduce dependency on price-volatile imported fossil fuels, the Mekong River is also home to one of the largest inland fisheries in the world and comprises a rich range of interconnected ecosystems on which local people's livelihoods depend. So, sharing the same rivers, hydropower development in the region is interconnected. Hydropower development in this context cannot be discussed in isolation from transboundary water governance, not only from the perspective of river connectivity, but also in relation to regional power trade and foreign direct investment flows. For instance, Laos' power generation from hydropower is mostly for electricity export to Thailand and Vietnam. The same thing, we can say that Chinese, Vietnamese, and Thai companies are the main investor for hydropower development in Laos and Cambodia, and probably in Myanmar in future. So while the transboundary aspect of hydropower development in the Mekong region is quite obvious, the application of international best standards for sustainable development remains challenging for various reasons. These include the central positioning of hydropower development as means to promote economic growth, the sidelining of environmental and social aspects in hydropower development planning and implementation, as well as the lack of systematic and integrated hydropower development planning across levels, not only at transboundary levels, but also at national level. International actors and national policymakers have tried to resolve the Mekong hydropower debates through the language of trade-offs, win-win solution, best practice, linking the very notion of sustainable development with poverty reduction and countries' desire for economic growth. Recently, various actors have also highlighted the important role in transboundary water diplomacy with the launch of the Lancang Mekong Cooperation in 2015, initiated by China and involving the 4 countries in the Lower Mekong Basin and Myanmar. While I agree that transboundary water diplomacy is definitely an asset, the question remains as to how it can strengthen current institutional frameworks for sustainable hydropower development and improve natural resource governance. So referring to this question, I would like to highlight the need to move beyond transboundary water diplomacy towards critical political economy analysis of large hydropower dams for several reasons. Firstly, the scale, scope, and degree of complexity of transboundary water governance in the Mekong urge the need to understand how actors and institutions configure decision-making structures, navigate decision-making processes, and influence development outcomes. And this understanding is not only important to weigh the costs and benefit from hydropower development, but most importantly also to know as to whom will benefit and or get impacted by it. And secondly, hydropower development in the Mekong region cannot be analyzed and discussed in isolation from the region's geopolitical positioning, as most apparent from China's strong influence through bilateral and multilateral relationships, as well as the emerging importance of the United States in the region. And lastly, I think understanding of the existing power structure and relationship that shape hydropower development in the Mekong region is eminent towards informed, inclusive, accountable, and just development. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. You very helpfully brought attention to the international, region-wide dimension of this problem. I hope that's something we'll come back to when we enter into discussion a little later. It's a great pleasure now to call upon Marie Mulyani to address us. Marie holds a DPhil from Oxford. She lectures at the University of Indonesia's postgraduate study of environmental science and is a module leader on ASEAN environment at the School of Geography and Environment here in Oxford. Mary, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, the organizer and Nigel, for chairing this roundtable. I will only have one slide. It's on Indonesia's energy mix and the target to reducing emissions by 2020 and 2030. Drawing on energy development in Southeast Asia, I will focus my remarks on Indonesia's energy challenges and development. Indonesia, Southeast Asia's most populous country, with 40% of the region's population of 6 116 million in 2013, faces a big challenge in supplying power to some of 50 million of its 250 million population who live in 12,659 villages without full access to electricity, including 2,519 villages without access to electricity at all. And as with other countries in the region, Indonesia's policy on energy mix is still dominated by coal, contributing 30% of its energy mix due to its inexpensive price and abundant stock. 80% of Southeast Asia's 28 billion tons of proven coal reserves are located in Indonesia. Together, fossil fuels represent 66.5% of the country's total primary energy supply. This all undermines Indonesia's efforts to achieve the emission reduction target of 26% by 2020 and 29% by 2030. Indonesia energy sector itself contributed 26%, which is equivalent to 519 million tons CO2 equivalent in 2012, and this was almost 52% increase from 2005 emission from energy sector. Moreover, there has been no clear path to achieving the targeted increase in the share of renewable energy from 5.6% in 2012 or 8% in 2013 to 23% in 2025 and 25% in 2050. And moreover, the planned construction of more than 100 coal-fired power plants, further challenging the country's effort to reduce its greenhouse gas emission. So with what seems to be conflicting policies, how can the renewable energy be accelerated? Indonesia has huge potential of renewable energy, about 200 gigawatt, including 40% of the world's largest geothermal potential and about 75 gigawatt of hydropower potential, and only 6% of the potential has been developed so far. Some identified challenges include the pricing regime, whereby the lack of financial incentive for developing renewable energy and high subsidy for fossil fuel-based energy have slowed infrastructure development. Another issue relates to Indonesia's decentralized political system, whereby gaining support from regional and district governments is key for both project design and execution, which can take 2 or more years to secure. Then there is these issues which is inherent within Indonesia's governance system, such as a low coordination of government ministries and between different levels of governments, rent-seeking, overlapping laws, institutional overlap, whereby there is no clarity in which agency is responsible for policy formulation and which ones responsible for policy execution. And then, of course, there is this increasing resource nationalism, which all impact the development of renewable energy in Indonesia. However, the establishment of National Energy Council, or Dewan Nasional Energi, in 2007 is expected to solve some of these issues and accelerate the development of renewable energy. Moreover, some policies and efforts to promote renewable energy have been incorporated within the National Energy of 2014, as well as within relatively new laws on energy, electricity, geothermal, which were enacted since 2009, and the new energy policy was enacted in 2007. And then also some government regulations on financial incentives and feed-in tariff were introduced in 2012 and 2013. So all are very good on paper. The challenge now is in the implementation, and critical question remains: how will these new policies and regulations, which will then to solve the issue of the slow development of renewable energy, can be implemented? Finally, just a question for discussion: what are the implications of Indonesia's energy policy for energy development in the region and for the mitigation of climate change within the region of Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Some very interesting points there. Thank you. Indonesian cheap coal is often seen as part of the problem here. It's the largest exporter of coal in the world and a major exporter. It's going to be a growing supplier to other countries in the region. Intriguingly, you've reminded us of the great potential for renewable energy in Indonesia itself. And you also drew attention to the important governance issues there, multi-level governance, challenges of rent seeking. And Diana stressed the importance in her presentation of developing a critical political economy approach to these issues. Perhaps that's something we can think about in the context of Indonesia as well. There's a connection between the two talks. Something to discuss. What is the political economy of the policy environment and the policy process in developing solutions to these questions? Now it's a great pleasure to welcome Andrew Campbell to our panel, who has come further than anyone in a positively heroic feat of commitment. He landed at Heathrow at 6 a.m. this morning, having flown from Australia, especially to be with us. So we're very fortunate, and personally I'm a little surprised that he made it in time, but he has, soon to be fortified with plenty of caffeine in the meantime. So it's great to have Andrew here. He holds many hats. Among them, he's director of the Research Institute for the Environment and Livelihoods, director of the Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research, and director of the Centre for Renewable Energy at Charles Darwin University. He's a great and experienced thought leader on the issues that we're discussing today. And we very much look forward to hearing from him. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for those terrific lead-ins. I'm speaking as someone who's been in Darwin for the last 6 years, and I've done a bit of work up in the Mekong on water governance issues, but mostly in eastern Indonesia and Timor-Leste on broader development issues. I guess, Nigel, your point about some critical political economy is really important, because early on you said some of our cheapest energy is also the dirtiest. That tells me that we're not costing it correctly, and it's not actually the cheapest at all. And I speak as a somewhat guilty Australian, noting that our Commonwealth and Queensland governments in the last few weeks have approved a single coal mine, open-cut coal mine, which is 5 times larger than the whole of Greater Paris, and will produce, if it ever was all burnt, the equivalent of 6% of global emissions in one mine. And humanity really cannot afford. We must leave that carbon in the ground. But we have enormous inertia vested in the status quo, and enormous political power vested in the old fossil fuel dinosaurs. And in our country, the extent to which the fossil fuel sector is embedded with our major political parties. It's now standard for ministers of resources to retire and then immediately go off and become lobbyists for the fossil fuel companies and all their senior advisors to all be working in the fossil fuel companies. And the general public cannot understand how at a time when we've now just surveyed to see that more than 3/4 of the Great Barrier Reef is bleached, but just upstream from that Great Barrier Reef we can approve a new coal mine in 2016. So we are not seeing the connection between the emissions, the warming and the bleaching. And we don't have an environmental governance regime in Australia that requires a minister to take the emissions into account when they approve the coal mine. They only have to take into account the runoff from the site and whether the runoff is going to affect the Great Barrier Reef. As far as we're concerned, if that coal goes to India and is burnt in India, then it's up to India to account for those emissions. And it's nothing to do with the Queensland Minister or the Commonwealth Minister. Now that to me tells me that we absolutely need critical political economy because we are not costing these issues correctly. Similarly with hydropower development in the Mekong. But I'll just share with you one little project. The other dimension with Indonesia that hasn't come up yet is geological instability. If you see a map of the Indonesian archipelago with every volcanic eruption, earthquake and tsunami of the last century as a single red dot on the map, I can assure you, you would not invest in a power station anywhere, certainly not along the main spine of Java, because it's simply too geologically unstable. So when we think about what sort of a grid could service our needs and what sort of power infrastructure do we need long-term in the region, to me, you need to finish up with something that looks like a spider's web of high voltage direct current cables, powered by renewables. Now, we happen to have an idea for the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, which would involve taking one or two cattle stations, each of say 250 kilometres squared, covering them in solar panels, 250 square kilometres of solar panels, not a few square metres on your roof. Putting that beside Lake Argyle, which takes an hour and a half to fly across. It's an enormous man-made lake for irrigation purposes, which is unproductive. Using the solar energy to pump the water up the hill to a very large tank and having a pumped hydro scheme. And in a paper with ANU colleagues, we've worked out we can supply 100% of Indonesia's energy needs in perpetuity from one scheme in the Kimberley, with a high voltage direct current cable going from Darwin to Dili to Denpasar to Jakarta and on to Singapore and Hong Kong if you wish. And it's infinitely scalable, and all of the technology is on the shelf right now. There's no novel technology whatsoever. HVDC cables lose about 1 to 2% per 1,000 kilometres in transmission losses. The cable from Norway to the Netherlands has been operating extremely effectively for a number of years now. In Australia, we connect Tasmania to the mainland through an HVDC cable across Bass Strait. It's extremely profitable infrastructure. And we held a workshop in Darwin 2 or 3 years ago where we invited Indonesian energy planners. And we thought we were going to be sharing with them this radical idea. And they put a slide up of our scheme. And we said, when did you do that? And they said, 25 years ago. We identified this was our most stable long-term power supply would be sunlight from Australia, because there's twice as much sun in the Kimberley per square metre as there is in Java. And that more than offsets the transmission losses. But you could easily plug in geothermal from Indonesia, tidal from elsewhere in the region, into such a grid. In my view, we don't need the big hydro schemes. We just need the geopolitical cooperation to put such a grid in place. But realistically, in an archipelagic nation with 10,000 islands, 900 of them inhabited, not everybody's going to be on the grid. So we need a system that supplies power to small islands and isolated communities. Again, we actually have about 80% of the continent of Australia is not on the grid. We're very used to off-grid, remote grid and mini-grid applications. And now we're seeing our first integrations of solar, diesel and battery technologies in remote Indigenous communities. And I would expect, given the cost curve of battery technologies, especially when the Tesla Gigafactory in Nevada kicks off in the next 18 months, that we'll see another order of magnitude drop in the cost of batteries. And then the idea of reconfiguring energy systems away from big centralised grids will become unstoppable. The economics will be simply... Solar is already way cheaper than diesel in remote operations. And so the only problem is the intermittency. Once you've got cheap batteries, then particularly if you can augment that with some geothermal or some wind, then you've got a solution. So, in my view, it's not even technically all that demanding anymore. The technical solutions are there. The really challenging bit is the cross-border power sharing, literally and figuratively, but overcoming the massive vested interests of the fossil fuel sector is the big political challenge, because those dinosaurs are going to do a lot of damage as they, in their death throes, as they thrash around trying to gain political systems to prolong their business models for as long as they can. They're going to do an enormous amount of damage. And the problem is that we don't have any massive renewable energy companies. We've got a whole lot of small and medium enterprises up against some enormous companies that are enmeshed with governments. And so there's all these David and Goliath scenarios around the region, and that's our big geopolitical. So your point about critical political economy is absolutely right. We need a revolution. It's a matter of thinking about how to bring that about. And it may be that the economics just becomes so compelling, but and it's great that we're seeing Jacoy and others now reducing their fossil fuel subsidies. But nevertheless, never underestimate the power of the status quo, as we're seeing with what to me are astonishingly negligent decisions being made in Australia about approving new coal mines in 2016. I would not have believed it if someone had told me that in 1998. But 20 years hence we would still be approving new coal mines. I would have just rejected that out of hand, and yet that's what we're doing. So that's my nutshell summary, and I'd be delighted to open that up for discussion.
Very intriguing and original solution that you've set out there. I'm sure there'll be lots of interest in that and lots of questions about it.
We can do it for less than $1 trillion.
Very good, very good. It's a different kind of transboundary or cross-border issue, if you like. And again, you've drawn attention to the fact that we need not only technical solutions, but political solutions. So it's the stuff of interests and governments and institutions as well that we need to address. And the point you made at the beginning about correctly costing the planet is well taken. It's the cheapest, also the dirtiest sources of energy, then we're not in some way costing them correctly. So it's a great pleasure now to conclude our panel by welcoming a very distinguished economist and leader to address us. Sir Tim Lancaster has had a very distinguished civil service career, has operated at the highest levels of government. Among other positions, he's served as private secretary to two prime ministers, Jim Callaghan and Margaret Thatcher, rose to become permanent secretary, the most senior civil servant in the Overseas Development Administration, now DFID, and then has pursued a very distinguished career career after government as an academic leader, as director of SOAS, and more recently as president of Corpus Christi College, Oxford. So Tim, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you so much. You know, large infrastructure projects, ever since the ancient Egyptians, have involved government and the exercise of the ancient Egyptians did it with water. And water infrastructure projects to this day involve government and politics and power. The same is true of large energy projects, because they involve public resources, they involve planning, and they involve regulation. And you see this today all over the world. It's inevitable. And the question is, how is this power exercised for the good of our peoples, or the reverse? In other words, are energy projects in the public interest, or are they not? And things get worse when you have more than one government involved. If it's one government, there are challenges. If there are two governments, there are even more challenges. And I personally was deeply involved in a major power project in Malaysia, which involved two governments. The British government that provided the money for this project, and the Malaysian government at the time that decided it wanted to go ahead with it. And the project in question is the Pergau hydroelectric scheme on the Pergau River in Kalimantan state of northern Malaysia. Now, I was the permanent secretary of the Overseas Development Administration, the British aid agency, which funded this 400 million project. It was the largest infrastructure project Britain has ever funded overseas. And as it turned out, it was deeply controversial, primarily in the UK, but it also created some problems in Malaysia as well. After I retired, I wrote a book about this project, which I'm not going to try to sell to you because I've only got one copy, but here it is if anybody wants to look it up. It's really a case study in governance rather than energy, but I do go into the energy aspects in some depth as well. And I'll just tell you very briefly about the project, and then I'll talk about the governance issues that arose. The Pergau Dam is on the Pergau River, a few miles from the Thai border. It's not a particularly large project. It's a 600 megawatt project. The real problem is it doesn't produce much electricity. The reason for that is there's a lot of cement and not a great deal of water. It's a peaking, it supplies peaking energy into the Malaysia electricity system. It works quite well, actually. It does work. But the problem is it doesn't produce much electricity because there isn't much water. And it's very expensive to build. This project was developed by British contractors in the mid-1980s and was lapped up by the Malaysian government of its time. The World Bank and the British aid agency, ODA, from the very beginning had grave doubts about the economics of this project. The appraisals that were undertaken demonstrated that this project was going to cost approximately £100 million more than the best gas-fired project that was available at the time. Remember, in the 80s and 90s, and even today, Malaysia has plentiful offshore gas. And at the time, offshore gas was virtually free. There was so much of it. Malaysia couldn't export it from Peninsular Malaysia. It didn't have any plants that were capable of converting it to enable it to be exported. So the technical experts, both in the World Bank, in Britain, and in Malaysia, the Malaysia Electricity Authority, all thought this was not a sensible thing to be doing. It was so expensive. Even though there could be said to be some environmental advantages, because even then people were worried about about carbon emissions. But even in retrospect, if one factored in a value for carbon emissions, it certainly didn't make sense. What I've done in my book is first of all look at the appraisal that was undertaken at the time, which showed a very poor return on the investment. I looked at it ex post as well, in which I put in some values for carbon emissions, and I also updated it for the higher price that now exists for the higher value for natural gas. And I still found that ex post it was not a sensible project to go ahead with. There were no environmental issues actually as such. People tend to think, oh well, it must have destroyed thousands of homes and created migratory problems. It didn't. Unlike some of the great hydro projects in India and China and elsewhere, this was not a project that created environmental damage. Anyway, the project was funded, and it exists to this day. It's a very beautiful place. If you want to do some fishing, go up to the Pergao Lake. It's a rather lovely place, but it doesn't produce much power. Why did the British and the Malaysian government get involved in this? This is a classic case of state capture, regulatory capture by vested interests, by vested commercial interests and by politicians on both sides, British and Malaysian. On the British side, you had three major companies. One of them no longer exists. GEC was the largest British company of its day, which produced electrical equipment, turbines. They were keen on it. There was a second company called Balfour Beatty. Balfour Beatty, and the third company was called Cementation. These were powerful companies who needed these contracts, and they put immense pressure on the Prime Minister at the time, Mrs. Thatcher, to fund this project. The situation was exaggerated by the fact that Britain secretly signed an agreement with Malaysia, which went contrary to all British aid policy to that time, and was contrary to international agreement that Malaysia should purchase £1 billion worth of arms equipment in return for receiving £200 million in aid. This was a secret deal that very few people knew about, and this drove, if you like, this project to some extent, because Mrs. Thatcher wanted the arms deal. And when the companies produced the Pergao Dam, this was a very neat way of providing the arms, or selling the arms. On the Malaysian side, it's a bit of a puzzle, really. Why did Dr. Mahathir, the then Prime Minister, want this project so badly? He did want to do something for Kelantan State, which at that time was ruled by an opposition party, the PAS. The Malaysians can tell me here what that stands for. It was the Any Malaysians here? What does PAS stand for?
Parti Se-Islam Malaysia.
Exactly, it was the Islamic Party of the North. He wanted to, this is a poor state, Kelantan, and Dr. Mahathir wanted to do something for Kelantan State. But more likely, and there were elections coming up, which actually he lost. But be that as it may, but the real reason why Malaysia wanted this was bribery. The British companies, almost certainly, though there's no absolute evidence, there's no concrete evidence, but I'm absolutely sure there were many backhanders. There were backhanders to the party, Dr. Mahathir's party. The treasurer of the party was a man called
Daim Zainuddin.
Excuse me. He was the treasurer, he was the Minister of Finance over many years, and he was particularly keen on this project. And the Minister of Energy was a man called Sami Velu, who led one of the minority parties. He had a long reputation for personal corruption. And there were others. So there was a deep interest in Malaysia in having these large companies involved, and indeed in having the arms deal. Dr. Mahathir's chief negotiator was a man called Aru.
Secret.
Dr. A.P. Arumugan. He was the chief negotiator. He had very close contacts with 10 Downing Street. He was in and out of 10 Downing Street at that period. And so the deal was done. There was a lot of shenanigans. I tried to stop this project. I said to British ministers, I will not, as the senior civil servant, authorise a penny of expenditure on this without a formal political direction. This is quite rare in the British government, that a civil servant does this. I was no hero. I didn't do it for heroic reasons. I did it because I knew that one day the story would come out, and if I didn't try and stop it, I would be hammered. My objections were dismissed by the British government. The minister who dismissed my objections was a man called Douglas Hurd. He was the then Foreign Secretary, a man who I respected enormously. But he, first of all, did not know about the illegal arms deal, which is extraordinary. His officials did not tell him about it. He was not around when it was signed. He was not the minister. And Mrs. Thatcher was no longer in power. So he decided that to protect Britain's interests in Malaysia, given the fact that Mrs. Thatcher had promised this aid, that the aid had to happen. Sure enough, 3 years later, there was a parliamentary investigation. The fact of the dodgy arms deal, illegal arms deal, came to light, and all hell broke loose here in London, in Britain. And to cap it all, a small and courageous NGO, the World Development Movement, took the government to court. And it went to the High Court, and the judges there declared that the aid was unlawful and contrary to the provisions of the Aid Act, the Development Act. And so at that point, the dam was half built. The contracts had all been signed, so the British government had to go on providing the money, but it no longer came from the aid budget. In Malaysia, well, Dr. Mahathir had the money. He wasn't terribly concerned about what was going on in Britain, and he wasn't particularly concerned that his officials had told him that Pogar was a poor deal. He had the money. It was a grant from the British government. So, British government, I had told the Malaysians that if they didn't have the money for hydro, they could have it for gas-fired, but they weren't interested in that. What did cause Dr. Mahathir a lot of trouble was allegations of corruption, which surfaced in the British press, and that did cause some trouble, but it wasn't that problematic. Dr. Mahathir got the dam that he wanted. What are the lessons of this story? First of all, as I said, state capture on both sides. Secondly, lack of accountability, certainly on the British and Malaysian sides. There was not adequate challenge through any democratic process, and that applies to the British side and the Malaysian side. This was not checked ex ante by Parliament. What it does show that ex post accountability did work. There were major investigations in Britain. Two select committees of the British Parliament investigated and were highly critical. And the British court system worked the rule of law prevailed. On the Malaysian side, no, accountability didn't exist. It doesn't exist to this day, in my opinion. So, the general lesson, I mean, this is a small case. 600 megawatts is not a big deal. I mean, Murray, you said that you talked about 20 gigawatts, I think. Okay, that's 40 times the size of Burgao. The general lesson is that in large energy projects, there has to be democratic accountability. People will still make mistakes because economics is not an exact science. And there are all kinds of assumptions that you have to make when you're assessing the economic value or otherwise of large projects. But what is essential is there should be accountability, ex ante. It's all very well for the British government to have finally admitted that it got it wrong. There were some longer-term benefits from that. There was a reform of the British aid programme so that this, I think, could never happen again, ever happen again, because of the trouble it caused. But what you need is accountability up front before decisions are taken. Thank you very much.
It was really a rich and fascinating description of a very, very significant case to round off our initial comments. We've really come full circle. Diana set out some arguments about hydro development and its international dimensions. Today, we've returned to some of those themes with Sir Tim's presentation, but on the way we've completed a journey that's taken us through Indonesia, through issues around coal, through the fascinating prospect of a high voltage solar and hydro generated power supply from Australia. There's much to take in here, and there's one common theme I think emerges from all these presentations we've had, diverse as they are. It's that energy is not only a technological question, but also a deeply political question. Technologies always improve. They always make life better, it seems. Does politics always improve as well? Or do we remain stuck in problems about developing optimal policies which help achieve our, in the best case, our goals of secure, sustainable and inclusive energy provision? So now's the opportunity. We have a little under half an hour now to open up to discussion, questions, answers, comments, insights. Very, very welcome. So please, the floor is yours. Anyone who wishes to offer a comment or a question. Yes.
Thanks to the chair and the panelists for what is really a very cohesive, set of papers. I do think that Sir Tim's example is a very sobering one in relation to the preceding talks, and so since it happens to be Indonesia I'm more familiar with, my questions are for Andrew and Murray. If there is little short-term prospect of political issues of the kind that Sir Tim has described disappearing, if that's the sort of world that we have to try to reform energy policy in, and if the mining interests in Australia and Indonesia are so very powerful, then surely the obvious approach is in part to make the development of whether it's geothermal or solar, come hydropower, something that is in the interests of these mining interests to invest in. I mean, we're certainly used to, in advertising, looking at Exxon or BP presenting us with how environmentally correct they are. Might this be the way forward?
You mean subsidies? Through subsidies?
Well, possibly. I mean, the point is in a sense, make it in their financial interest or indeed require it for a plant like the one in Australia to be granted. that a very substantial part of the capital which has generated that has to be put into research and development of this other project. Say.
Yes, very valid comment. The new regulations, some of regulations that were released by the government in 2013 and 14 even, was about financial incentives to basically help the development of renewable company. However, with the new financial incentives and feed-in tariff, whereby the government basically set the tariff for the state-owned company, PLM, to buy the electricity from the independent power producer, is still much higher than the price of coal. So together, coal is still half price compared to any type of renewable energy after being given financial incentives and helped by the feed-in tariff. So, and another thing with the renewable energy now is the initial capital investment is so large, and then again, because the price to the end user, which come back to the subsidy, is still low compared to, you know, the basically profit and loss calculation by the private sector, then there is very little interest to come to it. The government has already established a new renewable energy fund, which is, I think at the moment has about 450 million US dollar, and it's quite, you know, basically low compared to, you know, what you are saying. Basically, if we want to push the renewable energy, we need to make this industry very attractive for the big mining sector. The big mining companies are still interested again on coal because of the 5 cents per, I think, kilowatt hours compared to 10 cents of the other form of renewable energy.
For me, I think a big part of the answer is carbon pricing, and we're going to have to get there one way or another in the end. And when we do that, then those companies will adjust accordingly. That said, we saw Peabody file for bankruptcy this week, the world's largest coal company. And certainly there will be some coal companies that keep going for another couple of decades, but basically they know they're on the way out. It's just a matter of how much damage they do while they're getting there. The other policy instrument that I think we haven't used sufficiently well is offset policies. And while I think for some environmental issues, particularly biodiversity ones, offsets are deeply problematic. For carbon emissions, I think there is a degree of substitutability, and the offsets concept is valid for projects with significant emissions footprints. And that could drive, particularly in Indonesia, we're working on mangrove restoration, for example, where you have more than 5 times as much carbon per hectare as you do in the tallest tropical rainforest, and massive co-benefits for fisheries and coastal livelihoods